Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Centre for Policy Research. My name's Tim Wilson. I'm a senior fellow at the London Centre. If you like what we do, please follow us on Thought to Action on YouTube or on all social media, or subscribe and support us by going to patreon.com/thoughttoaction. We need your help. We are a think tank that tries very hard to take things from the theoretical to the practical. With me today is my good friend and retired Navy captain and genuine all-round good guy, Peter O'Brien. We are going to cover the minimum standard of response and universal suffrage on firearms. This is our Second Amendment project, and we have quite a lot of stuff up. If you go to londoncentre.org, there is along the menu bar across the top projects. If you look in there, you will see Second Amendment. And if you click on that and then scroll down, you will find things like minimum standard of response and various articles and a lot of information on your rights and our rights and the history and the benefits of the Second Amendment. Pete, welcome.
Tim, good to be here.
So, minimum standard of response. Basically, what we're saying is that self-defense is always justified and justifiable. In fact, it's so basic to our rights as human beings, it's not even mentioned in the Constitution, other than as the right to life, as in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We also in America are blessed by having the Second Amendment. And that means that we can defend ourselves with firearms. Would you like to cover a few of the benefits that that offers to the general public?
The one that I like to keep going back to is that, and this has actually been true in more than U.S. jurisprudence, but in U.S. jurisprudence, it has always been held that the police are not here to protect you. That's your responsibility. And in fact, in recent decisions by the Supreme Court, they have explicitly stated that not only the police not here to help you specifically, but that it is your sole responsibility to defend yourself. Of course, that raises the obvious question: is how do you defend yourself if you're not armed? And obviously, if you're if you're Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris, that's one thing. But the simple fact is that a 120-pound woman walking down the street getting attacked by two grown men, I don't care if she has all the training of Bruce Lee, she's not going to be able to defend herself. But she can defend herself if she has a weapon. And that simple equation, that if a 120-pound woman can defend herself against two men, is so glaringly obvious that it should be one of those things that can just stand alone. Okay, really, you want to reduce the number of sexual assaults in this country? Make sure women are armed.
Yep.
And I keep saying that to people. I mean, there's 100,000 plus sexual assaults, rapes in this country every year. 125,000, 130,000. There should be zero.
Yep.
And one way to get there, one way to move in that direction, is every woman over the age of 16 ought to be carrying a firearm. That's my answer.
I completely agree with that. And there are some really good recent examples of the effectiveness of firearms in preventing serious crime and injury. And the one that comes to my mind immediately is in recent times, the Mccloskey case in St. Louis, right, which there was a great fuss and lots of talk about how they threatened the crowd and that's what they were prosecuted for and all the rest. Actually, what it showed was that without a shot being fired, two people with guns were able to dissuade a crowd of something like 300 who had come from a background where there was a track record of looting, violence, and general lawlessness. And the fact that those two Mccloskeys were armed and showed people that they had the presence of weapons was enough to stop any violence from happening.
Right. And in particular, I think is to look at it from the other way around. Take a look at some of the countries in the world where there is essentially zero private ownership of firearms. And one of the horror spots of the planet is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has, of course, has had a series of internal wars, civil wars, insurgencies, guerrilla actions that have ground on for most of the last 30 years. Right now, they're in a relative period of peace. Relative is the operative word. But in a country of about 80 million, I think, they had 5 million killed in the last 25 years, violently killed in these insurgencies. And there are essentially no private guns in the Congo. There are, I think the number that I recall was there were less than 500,000.
Right.
And my answer is one of the reasons, if you will, one of the reasons why a group of bad guys, a group of terrorists can come into a little town and terrorize it is because they know nobody in that town is armed. Nobody.
Absolutely.
If you want to turn that problem around, arm them.
Yeah. I've mentioned it many times before. It's an apocryphal story about Yamamoto during World War II, but he was apparently having a discussion about whether the Japanese would invade mainland America. And his answer was no, we cannot, because there will be an American behind every blade of grass and he will have a rifle. There are 400 million private firearms in this country, and that is a national effective deterrent against anybody who's considering invasion. Bottom line is we would be one of the most heavily armed insurgencies ever known. And that would not be a bad thing in terms of if anybody tries to invade America.
And to take that one step further, I'm going to steal a line from John Lott. The number of guns, more guns, less crime, is Lott's reductio. But the United States has more weapons per head than any other nation on the planet.
Yep.
We do not, by any stretch of the imagination, have the highest crime rate of any planet.
Absolutely. In fact, may I just jump in and say that the president's belief that there is some sort of gun violence epidemic, if you take out, I think you may have been going here, if you take out the 5 most violent cities in this country, there are 93 countries in the United Nations at the moment. Our crime rate, our violent crime rate, our murder rate and all the rest, if you took out those 5 cities, would per capita drop to about 185th.
Right. And even with those cities in it, we are nowhere near the top tier. And particularly when there's a second, perhaps arguably more important point. There is no private ownership of firearms in communist China.
Yep.
Communist China is, take a look at what communist China has done over the last 50 years. Besides kill 75 to 100 million of its own people, they are in fact terrorizing the Uyghurs. They are terrorizing the Tibetans. They are terrorizing Hong Kong. And part of the reasons why, there's a lot of reasons why they get away with it. One of the major reasons why they get away with it is because no one in China is armed.
Yep.
And I think that's a significant point.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, it comes back to what you were sort of saying earlier about the law enforcement have no duty to protect you as an individual. You have a duty to protect yourself, and that is almost impossible without a gun of some sort. And that it has been summarized in the past of the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And what are police but good guys with guns?
It's also true that even if the police were to attempt to protect you, the simple response time problem it makes it virtually impossible. New York City is famous, rightly so, for having a superb response to violent crime. And the standard police response to a violent crime in New York is something on the order of 4 minutes and change after the call's made, 911 calls made.
Yep.
The problem with that, of course, is that most violent crimes take less than 2 minutes to complete. And so, the bad guy's gone by the time the police get there under the best of circumstances. You come out to a place like where Tim and I live, away from a dense urban center, and you wonder what the 911 response timeline is like. And the cops doing their best are going to get here in 10, 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, depending upon where they are in their patrol right now when the call comes in. So the idea that somehow something bad starts happening and I pick up the phone and call somebody, the simple truth is that for the majority of the planet, majority of the United States, you're talking about something happening in 15 or 20 minutes. And that's true. You go into parts of most major cities, the idea that the police can get there in less than 10 minutes, given traffic, et cetera, that's a shaky proposition.
Absolutely.
You may luck out, but you may not.
Standard response, I live 20 minutes from the nearest police department's site, and there are very few people patrolling our area. So my standard response time for police involvement where I live is probably about 20 minutes. However, there are other factors out here that make this a pretty safe area. And one of which is that a lot of people around here are armed, and they understand about things like minimum standard of response. And the question really then becomes, so with all these guns and all these armed people we have in this country, what actually is justifiable in terms of defending yourself? And that's one, I think, of a large case of, if you actually go to the trouble and take on the responsibility of firearms ownership, you need to train, you need to be trained, and you need to understand your responsibilities and what the limitations are. And the one thing I would say there is that for those of us that think ahead of time, the biggest responsibility of firearms handling and ownership is that taking a life is a very, very serious matter. And even if you've done it in completely justifiable circumstances of self-defense, it will ruin your life for months or years or even permanently. And that's worth understanding.
Yeah, there are a whole host of issues that you touch upon there, Tim. Even even if it's beyond self-defense, if it's in a combat situation, you're responsible for taking someone's life. That is a fact that will abide with you for years to come. So none of this is being done lightly. None of this is taken lightly. At the same time, it is simply good sense that people keep aware of their surroundings. They're aware of what's around their house or who's around their house or apartment, and that they occasionally think through what they're going to do if someone does try to come through the door or come through the window. And particularly the part that I think people need to think about too is, don't think about defending yourself. Think about defending your mother, your kids, your husband, your wife. You've got, look at the situation. You've got a husband or a wife who's in bed sick. They've had some issue. They can't move. Someone comes into the house. What are you going to do?
Yeah. And we are seeing more and more lawlessness across the country. This epidemic in California of flash raids on high-end stores and now apparently on their pot stores. These sorts of things tend to spread and become more and more frequent anywhere across the country. And although, some of us have the benefit of living out in very peaceful areas, the spread of this sort of thing is a concern. And as we were saying, to actually prepare with ownership of a weapon that can take a life, if comes a deep responsibility, and part of that responsibility is to be prepared. That means thinking through. It's situational awareness. It's being aware of what can happen. And what Pete's saying about defending your family, defending yourself, defending even your community and friends. One of the facts that is absolutely certain is that no gun zones, gun forbidden zones and what have you, are undoubtedly and statistically data-driven places where mass attacks and the like are more likely to occur. So shopping malls where they ban guns, schools, unfortunately, universities, places like that where they have no gun policies and where they actually try and penalize normal law-abiding citizens for exercising their Second Amendment rights, actually draw, to a certain extent, trouble for themselves and for those that go there. And if you are a law-abiding citizen, you have a duty not just to yourself, but as Pete said, to family and friends and community, to think about how would you respond in the event of being attacked. Pete, do you want to just talk a bit about how you go about
before we get there?
Awareness.
Yes, sir. Before we got there, though, I would add that of the 5 or 6 cities in this country that have high crime rates, high violent crime rates, high murder rates, etc., they make the possession of a firearm in the hands of the average citizen a difficult proposition. And I'll repeat what we've said before. While you can, in fact, own a pistol, carry a pistol in New York City, the odds are that if you find someone who's carrying a pistol, that fellow or gal is in the top 1% of the population in income. It is not the fellow who runs a cab, drives a cab, or who runs a corner store, who works in a corner store. The simple truth is if you're in the bottom half of the income ladder, you're probably going to have a very hard time getting a firearm in New York City.
Legally. Illegally. It wouldn't it be interesting if we could find out some way, and this is something I might try and do a bit of work on, how many illegal firearms are estimated to be in New York City? I have some numbers for Chicago. I suspect they would apply to New York, versus the number of legally owned firearms.
Right.
I suspect that the criminals probably outnumber the law-abiding, gun-carrying citizens of New York City.
Almost to a certainty.
And we will come back. There's a separate topic there, the one of universal suffrage, if you like. Second Amendment being the only right which is not applicable evenly all the way across the country. But going back to minimum standards of response, Pete, situational awareness, you're thinking through, you go out with, somewhere shopping or whatever with your children, and things start to go bad. What have you done before that, and what are you thinking about as it happens?
One of the things that I benefit from a host of training I had while in the service and working with some folks overseas. But one of the things that you learn to do is you never simply do anything. You never simply pull into a parking space. You never simply walk into a store. You're always looking in front of you and around you to make sure things, if you will, look right. I mean, that's the first thing that you'll find is that we're very well adapted, human beings are, to noticing things that are wrong. You can walk in and out of a room in your house 1,000 times. The time you walk and you notice nothing, the time you walk in the room and someone's moved the chair over in the corner, it will stand out. So we notice things that don't fit. And so one of the things you're constantly doing as you're doing your daily business, as you're driving around, as you're walking around, is you need to take a look at what's around you and see what doesn't fit. Or if you can't make that assessment because there's too many people or whatever, is look at the folks in front of you, and the folks who, if they are bad, would be a problem. Okay. So if everybody looks sort of like they belong on this street block, then you have to kind of do an assessment. And this is, this is the way life is you look at folks and you say, I've got 4 kids over here, 4 guys in between the ages of 18 and 20, and they're not wearing business suits. Okay, if they are bad, they're a problem because it's 4 to 1. So what am I going to do? Probably avoid them. Just steer myself around them so that I can keep an eye on them until they're out of the area. And it's that simple kind of stuff that you do all the time to make sure you're aware of what's going on, who's the possible good, who's the possible bad guy, and you are constantly assessing that. And it's something that you have to work at. It's something that it requires, if you will, practice of noticing people, noticing if someone's wearing the wrong type of gear for where we are. Why doesn't he fit here? Kind of thing. And people are going to say we're profiling. Well, one of the things we learned in the military was you profile everybody. Every single person is profiled. The people the people you think are profiled. Everybody is profiled. And that's the way you make it through the end of the day in a bad place where someone has a price on your head. You profile everybody. Doesn't need to be quite as bad here, but the same lessons apply. Take a look. Who up and down this street fits? Which car that we're pulling into here doesn't fit? Why are there 3 people sitting in that car with the engine running? I don't think I'm going to pull in beside them. I'm going to find another parking space.
Yep.
And it's just, those are the simple things, because what you really want to do is you don't want to get into a bad situation. You want to identify the possible bad situation and leave. I'll never forget a buddy of mine who was a pro at this. He's like one of the really awesome folks to walk through a bad section of town with, because he's got this amazing sixth sense. But pulling down a street in a large city in the United States a number of years ago, and he looked down the street and saw a van. He picked it up before any of the other folks in the car, myself and other folks saw it, that the van had 2 guys in it and the engine was running. And he kind of looked at it and said, it's either bad guys are about to do something or it's police are about to do something, but something's going on the street. And his answer was, he backed out. We didn't go down the street. Now here are a bunch of guys who basically can take care of ourselves, more or less. But the easy answer is avoid that street. Don't go down that street. And so we left.
And that's great advice. It really is. I actually still occasionally help to advise and train various people on the introductions of how to be safe. And situational awareness, such as you're talking of, is key in that. I always, just for what it's worth, I always start very simply with people and say, think about if there's a fire. Have you actually thought about how you would get out, how you would make sure that you could evacuate safely? I'm talking about a fire in your own house. You spend 8 hours a night. That's 1/3 of the day pretty much in your own bed. Have you looked at how you would get out if a fire broke out while you were asleep? What happens if a fire breaks out while you're eating in a restaurant? Do you know where the emergency exits are, or are you dependent on following the crowd? What happens if there's a fire in the shopping mall while you're there? Or, what happens if a tornado rolls through your local grocery while you're there? What happens if there's a real emergency in the shopping mall while the kids are off doing something else? And have you thought about where you'd all meet and how you would get away there? How would you make sure everybody was safe? All those little things build up towards the sort of thing that we were talking about originally here is, if the bad guys come for you, what are you going to do? Well, if you thought about it ahead of time, you're no longer doing a panic reaction. You're doing a planned, at least to some extent, reaction. And that leads us back to minimum standard response of what you can actually do to the bad guys that are actually coming at you. And this is something that the whole group of us, Pete, Tony Schaffer, and a number of others in the London Centre, put together to say, you see a guy you think looks bad, you can't just shoot him. That would obviously be wrong. That would be murder. But somebody starts to threaten you. Road rage incidents are quite common. Somebody really starts to get wound up, stops in front of you, blocks your car in, and gets out with a baseball bat. What do you do? What is the right reaction? And the bottom line is that we came up with this matrix of responses that basically say, you still can't shoot him because he's not directly and immediately threatening you. But at that stage, you may display your weapon to him to say, I am armed. If you carry on to try and attack me, back off, because you will be the one that gets badly hurt, not me. That sort of thing. Pete, have you got any particular comments about the minimum standard response matrix that we did?
Geez, you were just saying something and my mind wandered. The one thing that I'd like to go back to there is that the key to any kind of minimum standard response is we're always trying to leave the area. I mean, that's sort of the ideal situation here is it doesn't even happen to me. I'm gone. I'm not there. I have one of my brothers who is a true master at Weichi-Ryu martial arts from Okinawa, and he's been practicing it for 30 years. And he'll tell you the first thing you do is you walk away. The second thing you do is you run away. It's only when you can't run away that you fight. Obviously, if you got someone with you and they can't run away, then you're stuck. First thing you do is leave. In the military, we used to call that, it's get off the X. If you're being ambushed, the guys who set up the ambush have a spot they wanted to hit you in. Get off that spot. And so the first thing in everything that you think of is, how do I get out of here? As Tim mentioned, when you walk into a theater, the first thing you ought to look at when you walk into a theater is, where are the exits? Where am I sitting relative to the exits? You should know that. And so as you work through any of these matrices, the very last thing is, I'm actually going to put a round down range. I don't want to do that. I really, really don't want to do that. So how do I make sure I know what's going on around me? How do I defuse the situation as much as possible every step along the way? And then how do I exploit that, if I need to, that awareness, to make sure that I come out of it safe and my family comes out of it safe?
One of the key elements in police response and armed response of any sort is the concept of keeping threats to a certain distance. And the police tend to use 20, 21 feet for a number of reasons. We mention it kind of in the minimum standard response matrix. Up till that point, you're not really committed, and that 20 feet you can maintain by, as Pete says, running away yourself, for example. So anytime you get into a real high stress, high threat environment, the mind is going about 1,000,000 miles an hour. Fear is taking over, adrenaline is pumping in, your vision narrows, your hearing sharpens, all sorts of physiological reactions are going on. And as Pete says, it's not just about you, it's about the people around you and the people you might be responsible for and the people you are going to be responsible to. So a gun is a great equalizer for taking down serious threats, but it is not something to use on, shall we say, unserious threats. The fact that somebody's angry and shouting doesn't actually make them a threat of physical violence. That's always worth bearing in mind. But, however, one of the biggest things that we know goes on thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of times a year, is that the display of weapon, not brandishing it, not threatening people with it, but just the display to say, I am armed, is often enough to make bad guys reconsider and back off. Any thoughts, Pete?
I'll pass along something that a friend of mine, who was an Atlantic City cop, now retired, said. He was involved in a couple of incidents, and the second or third time, everybody had to go through the department psychologist, and as part of both the internal affairs assessment of what happened, as well as their policy to take, to see if anybody had a real problem. As he was going through the psychologist's review, the psychologist asked him, have you used your weapon before, before this incident? And he said, yeah. He said, often? He said, oh yeah, all the time. And the psychologist kind of, what do you mean? He said, I use it probably daily. And the psychologist at this point, the head is about to explode. And so what do you mean you use it daily? And he said, every time I step out of that car, I make a choice to use my weapon. If I'm walking towards a bunch of kids and I put my hand on my pistol, it says something to them. They recognize that the pistol is there. He says there have been times when I've gotten out of the car and deliberately stopped, made eye contact with the guy who looks to be the leader of the group, and pulled my shotgun out of the car. The whole situation changes now. And so he was using the display of those weapons to control people long before anybody got any kind of thought of there was going to be a round down range. And as a result there was never a round down range. I mean, I think he was involved in 2 incidents over the course of a career.
Can I just jump in there, Pete, and just point out to people statistically, it is a fact. Over 50% of all law enforcement will not fire their gun in anger during the entire course of their career.
But that doesn't mean that if you see the lieutenant walking down the road with his sidearm on, or and his buddies beside him got the shotgun on his shoulder, you recognize that weapon. You recognize those weapons, and that changes the situation, changes the dynamic, and it changes the dynamic in their favor. So, is that useful? Sure, it's useful. It helps to contain the problem ahead of the problem developing into something serious.
Yep.
And that needs to be engaged in the whole process here. The minimum standard response, as Tim just said, that process of is essentially making sure the other side knows that you're armed. That can be of great impact, as my friend demonstrated.
And we talk about minimum standard response because we are believers in the universality of the Second Amendment. I mentioned earlier that it is the only listed right in the Bill of Rights which is not universally applied across the country. The doomsayers and the gun haters, if I can put them that way, the ones who are frightened of guns for all sorts of reasons, some of them quite reasonably. I by the way, I have no problem with somebody not liking guns. I have no problem with somebody being afraid of guns. Although I think that fear usually comes from lack of knowledge and lack of familiarity. But they should not be afraid of good people with guns. Responsible citizens are very, very safe, and responsible citizens can be, the vast majority of Americans can be trusted with firearms of any lethality. It doesn't matter what type, how many bullets they hold or anything else. If they are responsible gun owners, they can be trusted with guns. And there are all sorts of obvious facts that support that contention. And I give you one. Just over the last couple of decades, there have been a number of states that have eased their gun control laws. We are now up to 21 states which are effectively constitutional carry. That is to say, without a permit, you can openly carry or concealed carry a firearm of almost any type. That is to say, long gun or pistol, revolver, whatever. Everybody on the gun control side of the argument predicted doom, gloom, and mass mayhem and murder, and brought up pictures of the old Wild West. Well, first of all, I'll say the old Wild West was grossly misrepresented. In Dodge City, the year of the gunfight at the OK Corral, the only violent deaths that year were the people who died in the OK Corral. People, good citizens, law-abiding citizens, can be trusted with guns. And that leads us to this business of universal suffrage. Those that actually have state permits, or, for example, it makes no sense that those state-sanctioned permits, when you go into a gun shop to buy a gun and they do a background check on you, if they do that background check and you're permissible to go ahead and buy a firearm, why does that background check not apply across the country? Why does that background check not say to law enforcement and the authorities, this is a responsible citizen who is now legally armed? And as I say, for those areas which have permits, there are some crazy situations still where I think most people will recognize that the most dangerous part, for example, of New York State would be New York City. I have a New York State concealed carry permit, but I am not allowed to carry with that permit into New York City. To me, that is insane. To not be able to cross state lines, even though the New York State says I am a responsible and responsibly armed citizen, again, makes no sense. Pete, what about, I mean, there are a vast number of other people who people trust inherently, and they're well trained.
Right.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I would go back first off to number you gave out earlier. There's 400 million weapons in private ownership, private hands in this country, spread around well over 100 million people, as I understand it. And of those 100 million people, very few of them are criminals.
Yeah.
And very few are ever going to be criminals. The fact of the matter is you've got 100 million people with firearms and they're not committing any crimes. They're not hurting anybody. They're not shooting anybody, but they do have weapons. Why aren't those people allowed to stomp around their town with a pistol in their pocket? You've mentioned this before, but make it specific. You don't, in any sense, no one says, well, the Fifth Amendment is all well and good, but in this case, we're just going to suspend it. The First Amendment is all well and good, or the Fourth Amendment is all well and good, but we're going to suspend it. No one says that. Rights are things that exist. They are rights that exist prior to the government. They exist outside the government. The government simply protects them. The government doesn't provide them. The Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, is a right. The government protects that right, but the government does not provide that right. And yet somehow we've twisted this thing around like a pretzel and made the argument that well, in this particular case, we can change things. And not simply because of the issue of the Second Amendment, but for the issue of the nature of our rights, that really needs to be addressed. And I would just throw that out for folks to consider is, do you think that the other rights ought to be twisted around as per each of the individual states, and in some cases cities prefer, or would you like to think that the rights apply and they apply universally across the board? And if so, why not the Second Amendment?
Do you want your rights to become privileges granted to you by the government? That's a summary of what we're talking about there, because if it starts with the Second Amendment, it will spread to the others. Pete O'Brien, this has been fun talking to you. Thanks very much indeed. If you like what we do, follow us at the LCPR on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on Rumble. We're on YouTube under Thought to Action. And please, if you can, follow us on patreon.com/Thought to Action. This is Tim Wilson for the London Centre for Policy Research signing off on this episode of Thought to Action. Thanks very much for watching.